Good morning. I'm Valfrido Vard, and I'm back to you. And today, of course, I'm talking from IRIE. IRIE. And today is important to explain what IRIE is, because we are making a solely English broadcast. IRIE is the institute. It's an independent institute, non-partisan think tank based in São Paulo. Our primary mission is to improve the interaction between Brazil, public and private sector through research, policy advice, and debate. Since its foundation in 2016, IRIE has been involved in bringing together intellectuals, politicians, and economists with different views to engage in a constructive and open dialogue, working as a platform of exchanges and meetings. And today, IRIE is honored to organize this first joint event with Global Americans, this North American think tank dedicated to promoting analysis and debate on relevant issues in the Americas within a global context. I am here with my dear friend, Guy Mentel, the Executive Director of Global Americans. Good morning, Guy. What are we going to do this morning, my friend?
Good morning, Walfrido, and good morning to the entire IRIE audience. And thank you for that generous introduction. So the event today is called The Future of Brazil-U.S. Relations under the Biden administration. And with our expert panel today, we're going to unpack what the recent election of Joe Biden in the United States might mean for the hemisphere and for Brazil in particular. And as Walfrido mentioned, my name is Guy Mentel. I'm the Executive Director of Global Americans. And for those new to our organization, I'd invite you to find us at theglobalameriCans.org. That's theglobalameriCans.org, where you'll find critical analysis on the region that seeks to broaden the discussion of the Americas and the Caribbean within the global context. So this is one of many webinars, as Walfrido mentioned, that Global Americans and IRIE are going to put together. So if you like what's discussed here, I hope you'll follow us online, on social media, and tune into future such conversations. With that, Walfrido, I'll turn it back to you. But thank you again for helping to organize this, and thank you to IRIE's audience and to our wonderful panelists for what is sure to be a great event.
I'm very glad, and I'm very thankful for our partnership in this live today, and the many others that will come in the future. And we have many stars. We brought together many stars today, Brazilian and American, to talk about this subject. We are very curious in Brazil about what's going to be during Biden administration concerning to the relations between the United States and Brazil. So, Guy, who we brought to talk about it? Please introduce the American side.
I'll introduce the American side. So we have, and we're very privileged to have Nick Zimmerman with us today. Nick is the Forum Director at Columbia University's Columbia World Projects Initiative, and he's previously served in the Obama administration in a number of national security roles, as Senior Policy Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, as White House National Security Council Director for Brazil and Southern Current Affairs, as Special Assistant in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and Western Hemisphere Affairs. And he's also a dear friend. So we're very grateful to have him here today and to get his insights on this topic and others.
Great. Wow. This will be great. And on the Brazilian side, we have two great specialists. Ambassador Rubens Barboza. He has many years of international economic, trade, and commercial experience. Most recently, he was ambassador to the Court of St. James in London from January 1994 to June 1999, and Brazilian ambassador to the United States of America in Washington, D.C. from June 1999 to March 2004. Ambassador Barbosa has held a variety of senior positions in the Brazilian government's Ministry of Foreign Relations, including as Secretary for International Affairs of the Ministry of Finance, really a specialist. And we also have Professor Fernanda Manhota. She's a senior fellow of SEBRE. She holds a PhD and a master's degree from Santiago Dantas. She's also a specialist in politics in the United States. She's a professor and coordinator of the FAAP International Relations course and serves as a consultant of the International Relations Commission of the Brazilian Bar Association. She is the author of the book Ideas Matter, American Exceptionalism at the Dawn of the Superpower, published in 2016, and several other chapters of books and scientific articles. She frequently contributes to national and international media, commenting news about the United States. So we have, as I said, great stars. Good morning, Nick Zimmerman. Good morning, Ambassador Barboza. Good morning, Fernanda, Professor Manhota. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Alfredo.
Good morning.
So, how do we start, Guy? We start with our questions right away, or we give to them some minutes for each one of them to develop initial thoughts about the subject.
Yeah, well, Alfredo, why don't we start with each panelist giving a brief overview as to how they see the relationship going forward, and then we'll dive into more pointed questions. So maybe we'll start with you, Ambassador Barboza.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'll make a brief comment on the 2 years Bolsonaro's government with Trump and with Biden. When Bolsonaro government started, Trump was the president of the United States, and they developed a very good bilateral personal relationship. And in foreign policy, Brazil became very close to the United States. And this had implications in the agenda for multilateral organizations, Brazil following the lead of the United States and becoming isolated in those organizations. And also we started following the United States in the criticism to China. This proved to be wrong from the Brazilian point of view. We were wrong-footed because Trump lost the election, Biden was elected, and in terms of China, we realized after a year that the dependency on China has increased on commercial terms and on health, the vaccines and the input for the vaccines. Then Biden was elected. And we, as I see it, we have during the coming 4 years, 3 phases of the Brazil-US relationship. A new situation, Biden emphasized new priorities, environment, China, protectionism, and the Brazil-US relationship develops in 3 phases, as I said. The current one is cooperation. All the statements from the Biden administration and the Brazilian administration emphasize the cooperation, goodwill. There were exchange of letters, but there were also criticism from US personalities, Brazilian personalities that are being taken into consideration by both sides. This is the current situation. So the John Kerry started discussing with the Brazilian side in the environment. The foreign minister talked to Anthony Blinken. There was the exchange letters between the presidents. So far, so good. The following phase is the multilateral negotiations. We had already the conference on climate change led by Biden. We'll have the biodiversity in China, the G20 meetings, and we'll have the Glasgow meeting, the COP26 to discuss the Paris Club of the Paris Agreement and Article 6. And we'll see how the Brazilian side will show its policies. We saw already in the climate conference was a good presentation so far. Many people doubt that they could implement what the president promised. But anyway, the Brazilian participation was a normal one, as expected to all 40 leaders. And the third phase, which is more crucial, I think, starting perhaps towards the end of the year and next year, will be the discussion between the John Kerry's group and the foreign minister and the minister of environment here, related to the problems in the Amazon, the illegal practice of fires, logging trees, and mineral exploitation. And this, I think, will have the United States associated with the European Union. And we'll see a very tough negotiations between the two countries. And probably with Europe, we'll have problems also with the agreement, the trade agreement between Mercosur and the European Union. And with the United States, the question of financing efforts to improve the situation in the Amazon. So this is the situation as I see it in a very brief, in a nutshell. Thank you.
Ambassador Barbosa is always great guy. He's always great. I'm curious about the American side. I'd like to hear the first thoughts of Nick Zimmerman. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Wilfredo. Thank you again for having me, Guy, also for the invitation into the Global Americans and IREE communities writ large. It is quite a pleasure and an honor to be on a panel with Ambassador Barbosa and Dr. Magnota. So I'll do my best to keep up with these two, but I fear I might fail rather quickly. When I'm asked about dynamics between the Biden administration and the Bolsonaro administration, I've made remarks along this nature in the past, but I generally think it's prudent to look back to the Obama-Biden era, in no small measure because largely the same team from the second term of the Obama administration is now in place in the Biden administration from both a regional and climate perspective. So when you look at the National Security Council at the White House, the foreign policy arm of the White House, the Western Hemisphere Affairs Office, it's being run by Juan Gonzalez. Juan Gonzalez was then Vice President Biden's special advisor for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the White House during the second term of the Obama-Biden administration. Dan Erickson is now at the Defense Department at the Pentagon overseeing Western Hemisphere Affairs policy. He had a similar role. Ricardo Zuniga, who is the NSC Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs, before heading over to the Woodrow Wilson Center at the Brazil Institute, is now the Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle, but again is one of the foremost Brazil experts in the U.S. Foreign Service, and I'm sure is talking to folks. And similarly, the U.S. team that negotiated a variety of different bilateral arrangements in 2015 and 2014 in the run-up to the Paris Accords, former Special Envoy Todd Stern's team, that is largely the staff that is now working with John Kerry this year. And so the orientation of the new U.S. team really stems from that era. What were some of the characteristics of that time? I think it's illustrative for what we might see moving forward. Well, we were at the latter phases of the Obama presidency at that time, and there was a real desire to use all diplomatic engagements, not just with Brazil, to deliver ambitious and transformational outcomes. And there was this sense, not just the sense, I think, from the Obama era, that the United States and Brazil, the bilateral relationship, had really yet to scratch the surface of the relationship's potential. that throughout the years, throughout the history, we've somehow kind of kept talking past each other, and that we needed to use the 2015 visit of then President Rousseff to Washington to raise the level of ambition of what the two countries could accomplish together. And the best space to do that was in the climate space. This was something that the United States had already done with China and India in a bilateral context. And so it made perfect sense to try to do that with Brazil. Now, we are obviously in much different times in terms of the politics in both countries. But I think the bottom line here is that the good news is the new US team is not composed of Brazil beginners. I think I'd argue that both from the appointee perspective and those who are being empowered in the US Foreign Service, this is one of the teams with most knowledge about Brazilian issues and Brazilian US-Brazil policy issues. And they know what the bilateral relationship can deliver. The complicating factor is that for most of these individuals, climate change has been at the very forefront of their US-Brazil experience. And I don't think that this is something that should be underestimated, because it's now been elevated within the Democratic Party, the issue of climate change writ large, as a core foreign policy priority. And so what does this all mean for the US posture moving forward? Well, I think that there is a residual sense that Brazil is one of the most important geopolitical actors in the world, that a good dialogue with Brazil is always preferable, that we have a robust bilateral agenda that goes beyond climate change, but climate change is at the very center of the relationship. And we have to engage. The United States always engages with countries and governments with which perhaps we have disagreements and don't share values. But there is not a lot of trust between the two governments. Partly, I think, fostered by the fact that there is a prevailing sense in Washington that President Bolsonaro is not necessarily an ally of the United States, but has really positioned himself as an ally of the Republican Party. And perhaps more precisely, not even an ally of the Republican Party, but an ally of President Trump. So there are some real hurdles, I think, to overcome here. I think in the short term, we can expect throughout the year that the bilateral negotiations between Special Envoy Kerry's team and Brazilian interlocutors will continue. But if we continue to see record rates of monthly deforestation rates, very little concrete progress between now and the Glasgow conference that Ambassador Barbosa just referenced, I think that you will see the United States begin to pivot to more of a sticks, coercive posture as we get past Glasgow and move into 2022. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for reassuring us that our suspicions were right. Guy, let's hear Professor Manhota now.
Yeah, let's hear from Fernanda.
So hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Wilfrido and Guy. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. It's always very, very good to learn, to be with Ambassador Barboza, which is a very great friend, and also to meet now Nick, who I have known for years studying and researching. So great opportunity to share these views. I would like to use my first speech here just to reinforce some of the thoughts that were already presented. It is very important, people, to understand that the interface between Brazil and US represent in more than 200 years the greatest line of continuity in bilateral relations of the Brazilian diplomacy. Some of the specialists here in Brazil would say that the relevance of this relationship make it impossible to understand Brazilians' foreign policy in economic, scientific, technological, or even in cultural arena without considering the dialogue with the US. So we have a very, very important and structural bilateral relation. At the same time, we are talking, of course, of two countries that are very different and that have different capabilities, which, of course, affects the way they behave in the international scenario. They are, of course, asymmetric power. I like very much the expression Professor Joseph Smith used in a book during the 90s. He used to say that we are talking about two unequal giants. So sometimes the United States comes to be more important to Brazil than Brazil is necessarily to the United States. And of course, considering the recent transformations in the world, the crisis of COVID, and the change of the government in the United States with Biden, bilateral relations, of course, constitute now a more interesting chapter in the study of Brazilian foreign policy in particular. I would say, just to give you my general impression of this moment we are living now, that since the bilateral relations are historical, profound, and very structural, as I said, it isn't likely to think about major disruptions right now. Despite that, we must keep in mind that there are very relevant divergences between the priority agenda of each of the governments, and this can generate relative distance from a strategic point of view between the United States and Brazil. Something that Nick just mentioned, for me, is the most important issue to be addressed. Despite being elected as a transitional president, as many people described last year, Biden has presented himself during this 100 days of government more as a transformational president than a transitional president. He has long-term ambitions in terms of his agenda, and he's trying to affect very profound elements in the United States. And of course, this agenda will affect the American diplomacy and the way the US acts in international relations, including Brazil. So we have a president that is very oriented by the long run in the US, and we have a president here in Brazil that is very worried about the short term. And this is very relevant to be taken into consideration. So I'm very excited for today's debate, and it will be my pleasure to develop this impression about how we are facing probably a continuity, but with distance at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manhota. Guy, I know that you're a very curious man and that you prepared some questions. So go ahead.
Yeah, I have some questions. First of all, I want to thank the opening presentations. That was wonderful. I think now we'll dive in a little bit more to the weeds, if we may. And maybe we'll go back to the US side of the ledger, and I'll direct the first question to Nick. Nick, you mentioned in your opening remarks that we have to engage even with countries with which we have disagreements, but in this case, real hurdles exist. So I'd like to unpack what those hurdles might be, particularly in the context of climate. And we know that President Biden and his climate envoy, John Kerry, have dived headfirst into climate talks with Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who is a populist who has scoffed at the dangers of climate change, even as vast swaths of the Amazon rainforest disappear on his watch. Members of Kerry's team and the team of Brazilian Environment Minister Salles apparently speak weekly, and the two have praised each other on Twitter and on other social media fora. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are the Biden and Bolsonaro administration's current perspectives toward one another? Are they clear-eyed? Are they ambitious? Are they aspirational? And what policy areas do you think are most ripe for cooperation on the one hand and potential conflict on the other?
Well, that's a lot packed into one, Guy. Thank you for giving me such a difficult question to kick things off. I will not forget this, and I plan on forgetting at some point in the future. So listen, I think from the U.S. perspective is essentially that you cannot have a mature, comprehensive debate about the future of climate change and anti-climate change sort of action if you don't engage with Brazil. Period. Full stop. So on some level, to deploy, I guess, although this is not wise to do, some Cold War terminology, if the asset is the Amazon basin and 60% of the Amazon basin resides within Brazil, to not have a dialogue to not try to work together to come up with better outcomes. Just it's cutting your nose off to spite your face in the very first instance. Kerry's reputation is as a hyperactive, hands-on, tactile negotiator. That was the case when he was the Secretary of State, I think, writ large. And then insofar as he had a lead role in trying to deliver the Paris Climate Accord agreements, he took a lot of that on himself. And so this is a continuity. I think this is, speaking of continuity, to Fernanda's point, this is an example of continuity, right? I mean, this is his approach. He digs in and he engages directly. And I think the hope is that Bolsonaro has geopolitically isolated himself in ways that Ambassador Barboza articulated well at the beginning of the conversation. And I think the hope in Washington is that provides the United States with some negotiating leverage. I don't think anyone thinks that this is going to look like the 2014-2015 climate negotiation with President Rousseff. But if there's some space to make material gains, the United States is interested in that. With that said, I think there's deep mistrust. And we've already seen that play out in the media between the back and forth of Minister Salles demanding $1 billion up front, the United States government anonymously, but spokespeople from the US government coming out and saying, no, we need to see progress first. This is all because there is a complete deficit of trust between the two sides, in no small measure because of the record on deforestation under Bolsonaro and because of the overt politicalization of Bolsonaro's relationship with the United States, where he's seen to be an ally of Trump, not an ally of the United States, and certainly not an ally of the Democratic Party. What are either, and I defer to Ambassador Barboza and Dr. Magnota on what the Bolsonaro administration's perspective of Biden is, but I would imagine that they consider Biden to be a thorn in their side, that it's an inconvenient to their broader political project. They don't want a falling out with the United States because it hurts their broader political brand, even if a lot of that was symbolism, not substance. And they're probably nostalgic and feeling saudade for President Trump. In terms of relevant priorities and goals with respect to each other, I think for the United States, climate is first and foremost, but it's all the other traditional items that have been, I think, on the agenda since Ambassador Barboza was playing a lead role in the relationship. Trade, trade liberalization and facilitation, defense of democracy in the world, China and the rise of China, the crisis in Venezuela. These are all topics that in theory, the United States wants to talk about with Brazil. I think from Bolsonaro's perspective, it's a bit of what I just said, preserving the relationship with the United States by showing itself open to dialogue, moderating Bolsonaro's rhetoric at the summit that Biden hosted on climate, and trying to take at least the minimal amount of steps to avoid furthering the geopolitical isolation in Brazil that we've witnessed in the Bolsonaro era.
Great. And Guy, before I make a question to Fernanda, I'd like to tell everybody that you are allowed to comment to each other and to fight each other, if you will. Okay, Fernanda, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the fight against corruption. You know that this is a subject that's very important to the United States. We have FCPA and a global jurisdiction of the United States on corruption matters. We have watched in Brazil the downfall of the Lava Jato, the car wash operation. And how do you think that Lula da Silva, President Lula, who has been some sort of cleared of corruption charges, stand as a new contender? And would a change in Brazil's government next year, that is not so far away, have a positive or negative impact on Brazil-US relations?
Wow, difficult questions. Let me just start by commenting on what Nick just said, because I fully agree with him. So just to make a very brief comment about relevant priorities and conflict and cooperation, I would say that in the eyes of the Americans, the priority themes are at least three. of course, environmental commitments, the technological dispute of the 5G involving China, and assure the advance of some internal reforms in Brazil. The American companies are putting a lot of pressure in the approval of an agreement that end double taxation in both markets. So it is something very important to the Americans nowadays. And on the Brazilian side, as Nick just mentioned, we have, as Valfrido said, the fight against corruption that started and gained a lot of momentum during Trump's administration and the bilateral visits between the presidents. And of course, we have the Brazilian candidacy to the OECD, which is very old ambition of the Brazilian government, and now more recently the cooperation in the vaccine diplomacy because of the pandemic and everything that now is making this as a priority. I would say that both governments find some convergence in this interest, especially boosting trade, as Guy mentioned during the first question, and defending, of course, democratization in Venezuela, for example. But at the same time, we have potential conflictive areas, especially in the environmental agenda. And I believe that we are now under a situation in which Brazil lacks credibility, which is a problem. But going to your question more directly, I would say that the relationship with the United States was, in general, good during Lula da Silva governments, but it is too early to analyze the future of such a new government, because if Lula won the elections in 2022, Lula would not be the same as he was years ago. Many things happened in this period, and Brazil is not the same in terms of its current challenges, including polarization in the country, which is very relevant in terms of domestic politics. So the construction of narratives are still not very clear about how Brazil, under Lula, for example, would face a country as the United States. In terms of fighting against corruption, I think from a general point of view, it is a topic of convergence between the two governments, as I just said, but it is a little bit complicated right now, because for Bolsonaro's government, it contributes to the political narrative that he created, and also that contributed for his election after the scandals involving the Workers' Party a few years ago and Lava Jato, as you mentioned. However, from a practical point of view, it is necessary to understand how this cooperation could happen now. Because, for example, Sergio Moro was seen for a long time as the government pillar in this cooperation specifically. He was in the US holding meetings on the topic and trying to establish some bonds. But with his departure and the accusations he made of political use of some institutions that are supposed to investigate corruption, such as the federal police, including the president, of course, the credibility of the Brazilian government was affected in this area. So that's why I would say that it is a potential area of approximation, but I would say that at the same time, we are facing problems of credibility, not just in the environmental area, as Nick just said, but also in this specific agenda of anti-corruption, Valfrido.
Great. I'd like to stay on anti-corruption for just a second, because I think we would all agree that the Biden administration has really placed anti-corruption efforts at the center of its work in the hemisphere. And while I do, maybe I'll give a shout out to Alfredo and IRIE, who have done tremendous anti-corruption work on their site and through their platform. So we have a resident expert here in Walfrido as well. But Ambassador Barbosa, I think I'll turn it to you if I may. I think we saw in El Salvador, for instance, with the dismissal of 5 Supreme Court justices, that the most serious threats to democracy in the region these days come from elected presidents who flaunt checks and balances that limit their power. And there were reports in August, I believe it was, of a scene similar to what we saw in El Salvador, which was apparently President Bolsonaro and several army generals nearly marched over to the Supreme Court to dismiss the court's occupants during an early pandemic confrontation. I'm wondering, from your perspective, Ambassador, what extent will the Biden administration find a willing partner in anti-corruption efforts in President Bolsonaro, and what obstacles, as Nick and Fernanda have alluded to, exist to get President Bolsonaro on board with the Biden administration's efforts?
Look, I will make some comments related to all that we have been discussing so far.
Yeah.
But first, you have to consider that Biden administration is at the beginning. And here we are approaching the last year. So the Bolsonaro administration will last just another year. So we have to take a more open view, a more long, mid-term view of the US-Brazil relationship. I think that we have with the United States one of the more dense relationships we have with all countries in the world. So the element of continuity will be there. I mean, we may disagree, we may perhaps clash in the future in some areas, but the quality of the relationship will continue. It's asymmetric, as Fernanda said, because the United States is the second largest partner, trade partner to Brazil, one of the largest investors in Brazil. So it's the relation, and the personal-to-person relationship is very important. The number of Brazilians traveling to the States, and we have nearly 1.3 million Brazilians living in the United States. So it's a very dense relationship, and this will continue. We may disagree up to the end of this government in some areas. The question of environment is the first one. You know, I think we'll clash in this area towards the end of the year, beginning of next year, unless we change the situation. And this is not what we are seeing here. The Congress is about to vote legislation very negative in terms of the preservation of the forest. There are initiatives in the government that are contrary to what has been promised in the conference last month. So it's a very contradictory position. Either we'll change our policy or we'll have a problem with the United States. Another thing, in terms of corruption, in terms of human rights, we had this violence in Rio. These are issues that I don't think that Brazil will coincide with the United States. We'll have differences in terms of human rights, in terms of democracy, because the approach here with this government is different. So, and the United States will have Brazil not as a major partner in those areas, with the exception of climate, because Brazil, in terms of the U.S. priorities, is very low. Latin America in general, with the exception of Mexico and Central America because of the immigration, the rest of the region is not relevant. Even Venezuela is not relevant to U.S. national interest. So I think that the element of continuity will continue to most part of the relationship. The mistrust, as it was mentioned, will arise in several areas, starting with climate. And we will see when human rights, democracy, corruption, violence is discussed. Our positions with this government, the current government in Brazil, will be different. But this will not damage the bilateral relationship, because there are interests from the United States side as well. I'm following the interest of U.S. companies in several areas in the Brazilian economy. So, and I'm following also the interest of the left-wing side of the Democratic Party. They'll put pressure on Brazil, but I doubt that Biden will make any gesture that would damage in the midterm, up to the end of this government, the interests of the United States here. And the last word about China. China is the highest concern in the U.S. foreign policy. Here is the country. We are concerned because we may lose support from China to vaccines, to import of agricultural goods. So we'll have a disagreement in this area as well. I don't think that Brazil will follow the United States in the G5, for instance. The Chinese companies will be allowed to compete here because the national interest in Brazil is different from the national interest of the United States. And I think that a country as big as Brazil, as diversified as Brazil, we have to put, as Trump said, Brazil in the first place. And this, I think, will prevail. And we'll need to have this position in our interest with the United States. We will agree with the United States sometimes, we'll disagree with the United States in other questions, and the same with China. We cannot follow either the United States or China all the way. We have to put national interest first before geopolitical considerations and ideological considerations. And we'll have to face what happens with the new government. We'll have an election, next year, and we'll see what happens in the remaining of the decade.
Great, Ambassador. Nick, I have a question for you. You know that President Bolsonaro brought to the Brazilian political scene some of the narratives and arguments of the traditionalist and the outright. In a certain way, some of the arguments that were used by Trump and Steve Bannon during the campaign and during Trump's government. Brazil, in that context, has marginalized communities, including LGBT people and African Brazilians, Afro-Brazilians. Violence against its members has increased under a president known for homophobic and racist comments during his time as a congressman and even as a president. What sort of emphasis might the Biden administration place on concerns for LGBT rights and those of women and indigenous people, which were not high up in the agenda under President Trump?
Thanks, Wilfredo. I think the question is a good segue, because I did just want to comment quickly on the points about continuity in the relationship more generally that both Ambassador Barbosa and Dr. Magnota sounded on. In general, I agree with them, but not completely. I think that there is some potential, depending on other factors, which may or may not come to fruition, where we could see, at least in some aspects of the relationship, a break in continuity. And President Bolsonaro's racy past, Wilfredo, that you just referenced, is one of the reasons why. So in the short term, I agree with both. I think you see continuity. And I think my base case is you see continuity, period. But if deforestation rates continue to set new records, if Bolsonaro's actions, while he is promising rhetorically certain commitments to the United States that are then not followed through on climate. We've already seen some of this in the back and forth on the budgeting for certain agencies like IBAMA and the Instituto Chico Mendes. We see more of that. We see ongoing deforestation rates increasing. We see more rhetoric that's polarizing and divisive. I think you could see a change in certain elements of U.S. policy towards Brazil after Glasgow. The fact that it should not be underestimated just how much Bolsonaro upset the Democratic Party with his overt campaigning for President Trump's re-election campaign. And this is not just an issue. I want to be very clear about this. This is not just about the far left wing or whatever one wants to call it, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Recently, just a couple of weeks ago, 15 Democratic senators signed a letter to the Biden administration urging caution and skepticism over providing any assistance, financial assistance to the Bolsonaro administration in the climate change space. Among several senators, one who signed that was Senator Bob Menendez. Bob Menendez is about as moderate a Democrat as one can find in the Democratic Party. In some aspects, he's even conservative. And he's also the chairman of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Brazil's brand has suffered across the spectrum of the Democratic Party. And if ongoing polarization and ongoing climate dynamics are adverse, I think you could actually find the Biden administration pressured by its own party in the run-up to congressional midterms to take some sort of action, particularly in the trade space. I'll just note that a new bill is being introduced by a Democratic senator, Senator Schatz, that would expand the provisions of the first wildlife protection law that the United States ever passed in 1900, the Lacey Act, to expand the restrictions and regulations that the Lacey Act has put in place for any and all products that relate to deforestation. I could see Brazil being targeted, and I could see Bolsonaro using that to defend Brazil's sovereignty. And I could see a spiral in the relationship that could deepen if Bolsonaro also wins re-election, which is we're far away, and it certainly does not seem likely, but nor does it seem unlikely. And so I think we need to be cautious. We're in an interesting and potentially dangerous moment in the relationship. I'm not predicting that things are going to go that route, but I don't think that we can be confident at this juncture in 2021 that it won't. And with respect to Walfrido's question, this comes into play because one of the reasons why the Democratic Party and civil society organizations writ large in the United States have keyed in on Bolsonaro is because of these very issues. I do think that you'll see indigenous rights, LGBTQ rights elevated in the Biden foreign policy writ large, not just in a Brazil specific context. And we saw that in the Obama-Biden administration as well. That can take a number of different forms. The State Department reports annually on human rights conditions in countries. The United States mission to the United Nations under the Obama administration focused on this quite a bit, bringing the fact that LGBTQ populations are frequently targeted in areas of violence and war zones into the UN Security Council. This was something that Ambassador Samantha Power actually took a lot of pride in. There are a variety of naming and shaming tools in the US foreign policy tool belt, and I expect that if the situation on the ground in Brazil continues in this manner under Bolsonaro, you will see Brazil in that broader mix.
Thanks so much, Nick. I know we're running up.
Can I just add a very short comment? Sorry for interrupting you, but I think it's very important to add in what Nick just said that we're also seeing in the environmental agenda, the United States making very clear that it will adopt the issue linkage as a negotiation strategy with Brazil. So they will be conditioning the other agendas to commitments and expectations in the environmental area. So sometimes I imagine that the same time of approach can occur in different point of views, such as the social issues that you mentioned. So besides everything that Nick just said, in the multilateral platforms or naming and shaming, Brazil can, by environmental and social issues, be penalized in signing contracts and in having competitiveness among its business around the world because of this kind of approach and the consequence that we are going to face. Just that. I would like to add issue linkage as a strategy.
Great.
We're coming up close to time. I have one more question. Well, actually, I have a million other questions that have been prompted by this great conversation. So we'll save that for future Global Americans IRIE webinars. But Ambassador Barbosa, maybe we'll end with this last question for you. I'd be remiss if I didn't raise the question of COVID in this panel, given its impact not only globally, obviously, but in Brazil in particular, which has the second highest number of deaths in the world due to COVID, and 1 in 3 deaths nationwide this year is due to COVID-19. And so my question for you, Ambassador, is, given China's increasingly important role in distributing vaccines to Brazil, what should the US do in terms of following suit and maybe prioritizing a greater distribution of vaccines to Brazil? And what sort of engagement would you advise the Biden administration to do to strengthen and stabilize Brazil into the future?
Well, I think that the vaccine geopolitical is expanding, and we're seeing China, India, Russia, and now the United States, Europe becoming engaged in trying to increase the number of vaccines for the poorer countries. In relation to the United States and Brazil, I don't think that the United States will be prepared to send a large quantity of vaccines to Brazil, because the priority is India, not Brazil. I think that out of this 6 million doses that Biden mentioned, a large proportion will go to India. If there is a gesture to Brazil, this will not impact here, because the dependence, the reliability on China is huge. So we depend, the 2 vaccines that are now major vaccines in Brazil are Chinese. Pfizer started this week to be used here in Brazil. So it's negligible. So I don't think that this political use of vaccines will play in relation to Brazil as far as the United States is concerned. I think that India will be the main target. And speaking about the other points that were mentioned here, I continue to believe that the only important issue between Brazil and the United States is and will be environment, climate change. And this will make a difference. From the Brazilian point of view, there are 2 other questions. The question of protectionism, the question of Buy American. This will have an impact in world trade, and perhaps this will spill over Brazil. This is a second point. So it's important to have these issues in mind. And the third point I mentioned is China, because if the United States asks the Western countries to follow its leadership without qualification, this will create a problem with Brazil. But outside these 3 issues, I don't see anything that can damage the quality of the relationship between the United States and Brazil.
Great, Ambassador. You know, Guy, why don't we ask them for a quick last word, beginning with Fernanda, because we know that she has to teach in a second. Let's do that. Fernanda, please.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Wilfredo. And sorry in advance for leaving the event before it ends, because my students are waiting for me, but it was a huge pleasure to be here with Nick and also with Ambassador. I would like to use my 2 minutes just to add something very important to what Ambassador Barboza just said, which is related to China. It was about that, my PhD research about the triangle US, China, Latin America. This is what I research nowadays. So I'm very interested in this triangle. And I would say that this doctrine, that there is a doctrine of what we call congagement in the US-China-Brazil relationship, with periods of greater propensity for cooperation and other moments of conflict. And accommodation or confrontation depends in general in the way the US perceived threat of China in the region, and in the identification of potential benefits obtained by the Americans in the approximation, in the interaction between China and Latin America. So if we want to analyze in the future how this relationship will be and how the Chinese presence will affect the relationship between Brazil and the US, for example, we must take into consideration these two aspects, because depending on the way they balance, it generates a different approach of the Americans in the region. But thank you very much for your time. And, I would like to thank the audience for following us today. And Guy, Wilfrido, please count on me for all the next events, and see you all again later.
We definitely will. Thank you very much, Fernanda. Ambassador Barboza,
Much, Fernanda.
Please, your last words.
Well, as I said, I think that the US-Brazil relationship will continue very strong with hiccups here and there. And the major point to be noted in the future is environment. And the US companies or people interested in Brazil should start looking into the election, the next year election, because it may continue with the same government here, or it may change. If a new president is elected, perhaps the domestic policy will change dramatically, as it has changed in the United States. What happened in the United States is a good example to see from minus to white and black change in domestic politics. And this may happen here again, here in Brazil. So I believe that we will continue to have a strong relationship, and here and there we may have some problems, but the only serious problem, I think, in the short term is environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Guy, let's finish with Nick's words.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, just to echo my fellow panelists again, thank you for the opportunity, Wilfrido and Guy. It was really a pleasure and an honor to opine alongside someone like Ambassador Barbosa, and thanks to all for tuning in. Just to reiterate, in broad strokes, I largely agree with Ambassador Barbosa's assessment of the relationship. It's a robust and dense relationship that has a lot of history to it. The key question, I think, through 2021 and into the beginning of 2022 is just how serious those environmental related hiccups might become. And I don't think we should preclude the possibility that it actually becomes a bit of a problem, in no small measure because of how the politics here in the United States are changing around the issue, and in no small measure because of how the Democratic Party has begun to evolve in more of a big tent direction, with an undue amount of interest and attention in Brazil because of some of the racier elements of the Bolsonaro government. I'll just conclude also by saying, with respect to vaccines and the pandemic, just to tie the loose ends, I largely agree with Ambassador Barbosa. I'm not sure that you'll see Brazil being sort of an initial prioritized target of any sort of US vaccine diplomacy. I think in addition to India, you'll see quite a lot of prioritization put on Mexico and Central America because of the migration situation there. And in fact, the very first doses that were loaned out by the United States went to their North American neighbors in Canada and Mexico. My sense is that the United States has been slow in distributing the vaccines because we are increasingly having an uptake problem here, where we are getting to a point now where our uptake numbers are slowing because of vaccine hesitancy amongst the population. And there's some residual fear in the United States that if we start shipping massive amounts of vaccine abroad, that will reinforce the message that people don't need to take their vaccines here. And so I think in Washington, they're just waiting for a slightly higher threshold before they do it. I expect many more than 6 million to start being distributed sometime later in the summer. And unfortunately, given the state of where we are in the pandemic globally, I don't think at that juncture the window will have been shut for the United States to make an impact in pandemic management. That might not have a Brazil focus, to Ambassador Barbosa's point, but I think that it's a space more generally that we should watch, because I think more and more countries, as they get their situation under control, are going to start I think moving in that direction for geopolitics, but also because, as we've seen with the rise of variants over the past year, there's no such thing as a safe individual country when you're in the middle of a global pandemic. And I do think that the public health team of the Biden administration has taken that to heart, and we'll see some development in that space in just a few months. Again, it was such a pleasure to be with you all today. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Nick. You know, Guy, I hope you liked it, because I liked very much.
No, I loved it.
And I think we should do that again and again and again.
100%. You can count on us, Wilfredo. It's been a real pleasure, and I'd like to also extend a warm thank you to all of our panelists and to all who are in attendance today. This is one of many, as Wilfredo alluded to, forthcoming Global Americans and IRIE webinars that we'll be rolling out in the weeks ahead. So please look to our respective websites for more information on that. And again, it's been an extraordinary honor to share the virtual stage with all of you, with my friend Wilfredo, and to bask in all of the work that you all are doing throughout the hemisphere. So with that, I'll turn it to Wilfredo for final words.
Thank you so much, Guy. It was a great honor for us. It was so instructive. I was educated by these 3 stars that we brought together this morning. Thank you very much, Ambassador Rubens Barboza. Thank you very much, Nick Zimmerman. You were great. Thank you very much, Fernanda Manhota. You're not here, but you'll hear that and watch that later. Thank you, everybody who watched this, and see you later. Bye-bye.